This is The Data Slice, hosted by the Data Science Alliance. It's where we sit down to talk all things data science, AI, and tech, any way you slice it. I'm Callan Hallman, and joining us today is Courtney Crosby. She is the Director of AI Special Missions at Booz Allen Hamilton, and she is here to tell us all about her experience with using AI and data in the world of the defense sector. Really interesting stuff. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you.
Welcome to the podcast.
Very excited.
How are you doing today? Good?
Very good. Thank you. Yeah. How about you?
Very good. I've been really excited to have you on our podcast because your experience, your role in the industry, a little different than some of the other sectors we've discussed in the data science world so far. So really excited, but maybe just for a little bit background for our listeners, could you maybe first just tell us, a little more about yourself and your career path? Like I mentioned, you're at Booz Allen now, but what was kind of your journey to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, directing AI special missions for Booz Allen, which is essentially any place that we do artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science within the special missions space. So it does have a military focus, which I think is some of what hopefully we can get through in this episode. We're really excited about. But a lot of that is just based on how we use data and technology to solve some of our nation's most critical missions. A lot of that is from my background. I kind of did not start in the technical space.
Okay.
I actually was like a poli-sci major and, more on the international relations side, which is how I started to get more involved in the military sphere. And then just slowly over time with how technology was advancing and how we started incorporating advanced tech into a lot of the missions that we were doing, just slowly but surely kind of pivoted over time into a lot of what have now become our foundational AI programs within the department.
So it sounds like where you are now isn't necessarily
not
where
at
you
all.
thought you would end up.
Not at all. Definitely 10 years ago, I would have never imagined this. But I think with a lot of my background, and you start to see this more and more of, different experts and technical architects that we have within the military space who actually don't come from a purely technical background and are really able to bring a little bit more of a holistic approach to a lot of the solutions that we're bringing to bear today. So It's exciting.
Yeah. So could you talk, I know you touched on it a little bit just now. Could you tell us just a little bit more about your role right now and kind of how you really implement AI and data into that?
Yeah, so special missions is an area within the Department of Defense where we focus on a lot of the most critical mission sets, particularly within special forces and sensitive activities, campaigns that we have downrange. So these are by and large the missions where we have the most criticality around what we do. We're talking about the most elite operators. We're couching that within the context of the Alliance, right? We want to be able to use that data to enhance the performance of that community, and really thinking through how we use advanced technology to promote and solve, some of the hardest problems within what we would call no-fail missions, where failing is not an option. And so the necessity and kind of the criticality around the solutions that we bring to bear, I think have a little bit more sentiment and a little bit more kind of severity, right, around how we approach that, which requires thoughtfulness in how we architect what, eventually, whether it's an algorithm or a data solution, right, thinking through and really being able to be deliberate about the actual process of getting there, using the right methodologies for the right problem and understanding and defining and articulating that problem well.
You use the word critical, kind of high pressure on the way the AI and data, just the tech in general, is used to reach that outcome.
It's a responsibility.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. So I know you kind of mentioned the Alliance DSA, the nonprofit that hosts this podcast. Our big focus is, the ethical considerations around using data and AI. So what has that been like for you in such that kind of unique situation where there is such high level importance?
Yeah.
What are some of the, steps or considerations that you make or your team makes when it comes to kind of the ethics of all that?
Yeah, I think obviously, and you have had some folks on the pod who have talked about it in some of your recent episodes around responsible AI, data governance, a lot of these topics that have now become commonplace in the discourse around AI and technology. And I think that that is the starting point from which we've had a lot of these conversations around what that responsibility looks like and how do we do this ethically. I think extrapolating that out and putting it into our world, I think we might be the first military-oriented episode that you've done.
This definitely is. Yes.
And so I think what's really interesting about that is that when you have a lot of these discussions, particularly in contexts or, environments where you're talking about data for good and AI for good and these community-centered organizations and initiatives, sometimes we see that as apart from what we do within the department. And I think what we're collectively trying to do is pick those things up and apply them to what we're doing, and not just apply them, but leading from the front in a lot of those conversations and making sure that we are actually putting forward initiatives, data governance, policies, frameworks that are the first to be put out there in the military space, and really ensuring that we are embodying that in what we do. I think the other piece of it is also understanding the unique contexts and dynamics through which, or the lens, right, through which we think about data for good and we think about community. And I think that's some of the more interesting pieces, when I consider a lot of what the Alliance is doing and try to translate that into my workspace is like, what does community mean to us? And I think, we can talk about some examples, but, we've implemented a lot of like, what is our responsibility to elite operators, to our community? What is our responsibility to, understanding data and being able to use that in a way that increases survivability, that increases outcomes for the operators who are on these missions, and really think about the promotion of the health and survivability of that community.
Yeah, a lot of our talks so far have centered around community issues like food insecurity or homelessness, and how data AI can help nonprofits helping with those issues. But like you just said, there's all sorts of ways it's used, and Department of Defense is a whole kind of separate industry in a way that heavily relies on it. But would you say it kind of sounds like in ways it's very similar, though, even if we're not talking about a local nonprofit, there is still very much that human aspect and human impact with the tech that you're using.
Wherever there is war, there are human beings.
Yep.
I think that perspective for me is very much rooted in my background. I come from a cognitive science, decision science background, which tends to be more heavily biased toward psychology and cognitive engineering. And so I think I have a slightly different perspective. But yeah, where there's war, there's humans. Where there are humans, you have these unique pockets, of people of various intersectionalities where we need to consider how the data that we have available to us enables those missions. I think one really good example of that is what we've seen lately around the amount of data that we have available around female tactical athletes, for example, and understanding the responsibility that we as a department have to tactical athletes and their human performance, but also the sub-communities within that where historically we have not had the data that was needed to conduct research, to achieve the outcomes that we needed to be able to accelerate the resourcing, the equipment, the deployment of some of those operators and tactical athletes into the mission sets that are the most critical. And so I think we're starting to reframe that a bit, and a lot of that is very synonymous with the work that the Alliance does. And we have even seen a lot of really, really great partnerships between medical experts out in the civilian sector, providing a lot of insights and research support to some of these topics, a whole slew of nonprofits that have started and are now extremely prominent in pushing that agenda and making sure that we have the right data, we have the right research, we have the right voices in the right places on the right platforms to be able to promote those conversations.
Could you talk a little bit more about tactical athletes? I know you just mentioned that. So maybe for people who don't know, could you kind of explain what that means and what they do?
Yeah, so a tactical athlete is a way that we frame essentially any human within the Department of Defense, for example, though this can apply to law enforcement and other sectors as well, where there is a requirement for a certain level of physical, mental, psychological fitness to be able to conduct operations, right? It's the functionality of a human being in the world or environment in which we operate. And obviously, historically, for folks who are not as educated on some of the military history here, women were previously excluded from certain military occupational specialties where the level or the standard required for those tactical athletes is, again, some of the highest standards that we have for the most elite operators within the special operations community. And because women were barred from those military occupational specialties, there was no research. And so now that those job fields have been opened and we're able to have a more diverse talent pool to draw from to ensure that we have the best operators on the team, now we have to go and look and say, do we have the right equipment? Have we done the right research? Do we have the right programs in place to be able to support tactical athletes across the board? And as we do that, for example, with a lens toward female tactical athletes, what else do we learn about the population writ large that will help us as well? And I think that those are some of the areas where we have the most promising kind of work being done around how do you best support the entire community and how does that improve our missions and the way that we think about them.
It sounds like the data has made a really big impact on all of it in general, but especially, like you said, the way that women have been able to kind of find a place at the table in that realm.
Yeah, and you think about it. So a couple really just straightforward examples. The way that women carry weight. So if you think about a military operator and the amount of kit that they carry with them, right? All of the equipment that you see, whether you've been exposed to a military environment or military personnel, direct, like one-on-one interaction, or you've seen it in the movies or whatever it might be. Simple things around the kit that we have, how women wear that kit, how we train to be able to be most effective under those conditions, are all things that had not previously been studied within this context. And so when you look at things like energy expenditure, when you look at center of gravity, right? Women's center of gravity is anywhere from 8 to 14% lower than men's. And so historically, we have had this idea that all of the kit that is worn that you ruck with, so carrying weight over distance, you want it to be high and tight on your back. How you pack that weight matters. Well, when you translate that into the context of a female tactical athlete, actually that is not true. We want to carry the weight a little bit differently. And we know that because of anatomy, we know that because of physiology, and we're able to think through how will you be most effective carrying this weight. And the most interesting part of that is that we've learned that when you carry weight in an inefficient manner based on your body, it can have impacts to your muscular system, to long-term medical. You've had a couple episodes on around using AI and technology to improve medical outcomes.
Yeah,
we now know these things, right? And so we're able to take these studies and be able to say, okay, now let's develop a program where we can increase your hip adductor strength, which is one of the highest predictors of vertical excursion. We can work on scapular exercises to improve your strength in that area. And that's how we kind of retroactively address the situation. But then we can also look at the equipment. How do we talk with equipment manufacturers to design equipment specifically for female tactical athletes and operators? And then in that process, we also learned that carrying weight like that is also actually only efficient for men under certain circumstances, under certain conditions. So on flat terrain, this idea of high and close or high and tight actually only applies to men in certain conditions. And so how do we then help the entire population better understand how to move efficiently in these operations? And so I think little things like that, where we're able to better understand not only one piece of the problem, but then extrapolate out what we find into other areas of the community is where we can see the most impact, I think, over a long term.
It's so interesting. It's almost crazy to think how much knowledge was gained through the data that just wasn't there before. If that has directly impacted performance, outcome, everything kind of ties together in a way.
Yeah. And I think particularly within the military space, we tend to think of, the standard and what is expected. and you meet that standard or you do not. And I think what we want to start shifting the conversation toward is what factors influence that standard and what factors influence your ability to meet that standard. And so as we think through, backwards planning almost, if you have to do a ruck march, a 12-mile ruck march in 180 minutes, that is a starting point for us from a data perspective. And how do we back out what that energy expenditure looks like? How many calories are you burning? We know based on the data, it's about 300 calories per hour. How do we best create a nutrition plan for you to be able to perform at your peak? How do we understand based on the terrain? We know that your energy costs are going to be higher if you're walking on dirt instead of pavement. We know that they're going to be higher if you're in a swamp. They're almost 2 times higher if you're in a swamp as compared to, 8% higher if you're on dirt. And so how do we use that to understand, okay, if you're only training on pavement, for example, so, you're out here training and you're doing it on the streets, on the sidewalk, you're likely to miss that standard by anywhere from 14 to 43 minutes. So how do we bake that in? We can do that proactively and just make you faster, or we can train in different environments. And so I think that's what we're trying to get to of how do we create the right underlying infrastructure and the foundation for everyone to be able to meet that standard.
It sounds like you've really seen the direct impact that using data can make on just the way an entire team or industry really operates as a whole.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is understanding and being able to use data as a way to start that conversation and as a way to educate leaders, to educate influencers, to educate manufacturers as to what needs to be done and what that path looks like from where we are today to the future fight that we see ourselves in. And I think a lot of that is using data as a tool to be able to direct conversations around how do we develop the right resourcing? How do we use data to identify the right funding mechanisms to be able to support some of these initiatives? How do we use the data to identify the best way to promote a lot of the human performance related work that we're doing? And really using it almost as like a tactic to ensure that we have the right people in the fight when they are needed.
When it comes to AI, are there any algorithms or models? We've talked a lot about analyzing data, kind of, obviously there's lots of overlap there, but kind of on the AI side of things, is there anything that's especially helpful for your team?
Yeah, I think when we want to leverage AI within this space, a lot of what we're looking at is it can be anything from the simulation or the test and evaluation of it, right? When we talk about a lot of these missions, we're talking about a very select number of people that can perform these missions under conditions that are extremely difficult to recreate, and often using resources that the department does not have unlimited amounts of. And so I think when we start thinking about the use of technology in these spaces, what we are trying to look at is, how can we do simulations and test and evaluation differently so that we can better understand how these circumstances evolve over time and how we use that understanding from those simulations or T&E to better architect the right solutions to those problems. As an example, talking about rucking, it's extremely difficult to get a representative sample size to go out and ruck for 3 hours for you to get all of the data that you need. You're talking about human testing as well from a research perspective, which includes a whole slew of other parameters that you need to meet ethically. And so what we're able to do is use technology in those situations to better understand differences in anatomy, in physiology, in the way that we respond and react to things, right? If you are in a mission under load, how is your body responding to that? Some things we can't change. And so what happens when those variables come up? How do we respond to it? We've seen it also in terms of better prescribing the way that we conduct missions. So during planning and analysis, if we understand, for example, in a training environment or even a live mission, we have specific objectives that we're trying to meet. So in the context of something like breaching, where we're using explosives to breach an area, to breach a building, a door, whatever it may be, how do we use AI to better understand the impacts of those explosions on the operators that are in that area? But then is there a way that we can better develop processes and methodologies to avoid the negative impacts of those impacts? So leveraging things like pressure gauges and overpressure to better understand why is the number 2 man or the number 2 woman in that line actually more impacted physiologically, medically, than the breacher. Mm-hmm. Understanding those anomalies is really important. And then how do we prescribe a different way of executing against that objective to better improve the survivability of the entire team? So I think that's where we're trying to use AI more specifically. We can also apply that as far back in the process as the selection pipeline, for example, in recruitment, which, again, trying to draw the parallels between the military and civilian sectors, understanding every organization is using technology in their recruiting processes. Mm-hmm. The military is no different. And so how are we understanding how to best leverage algorithms in that scenario in a way that is not biased, given that the entire population that we have been working with up until very, very recently fit a very specific archetype, a very specific identity of individual that was going through that process. And so we're trying to implement AI in ways that allow us to better understand what we're working with and the problems that we have in front of us, to hopefully, again, the future fight is going to look very different than the one that we're in today. And so how do we have the right individuals in the force? It's a very long process within special missions, within the special operations community, to start that process, make it all the way through selection and assessment, and eventually make your way onto a team. And so knowing that that is a multi-year process, if we want to be prepared for the next fight, how do we use technology to understand and better architect those decision timelines so that the decisions that we make today get us in the vicinity of where we want to be 5, 7, 10 years from now?
You mentioned being prepared for the next fight and how next fight, future fights will not look the same. Everything we're talking about, data and AI, rapidly evolving all the time, changing life worldwide. So is there anything that is being done, you think, to prepare in terms of knowing we're not the only ones, with access to data and to AI and using it to enhance how we operate? So is the entire world. So are there concerns there, or maybe, steps being taken to be prepared for that type of fight, I guess, using the word you used?
No, absolutely. I think the first piece of it within the military context is that we are operating against timelines that we have not operated against in the past. Not only does technology develop on a much faster timeline, right? The clock speed of the technology industry is extremely fast. That clock speed does not align with the clock speed of our acquisition cycles, of our just broader decision-making processes. I think that there is a lot of work being done to bring those two things into alignment, which is an entire problem in and of itself that brilliant minds are working to solve. Taking that one step further, how do we make sure that we have the right technologies within the department when we cannot operate on certain timescales, when we are working within certain constraints? I say all of the time that these blue sky ideas that often promulgate and are just extremely popular in the civilian or commercial sector don't meet the constraints and the parameters that we have within the Department of Defense. And so you actually have to think really brilliantly and color inside the lines, right? And so a lot of what we're trying to understand is how to leverage technology that might be developed in the commercial sector and apply that within the Department of Defense. That is often extremely difficult to do at scale, especially in a community like mine within special operations, because it is such a critical mission with a select group of people with skills that you cannot scale. It's actually part of who we are as a community, is understanding and really owning the responsibility of the fact that our operators do things that no one else can do. And so how do we understand how to solve those problems? I think that we have a very traditional view of taking something from the commercial sector and trying to get it from, a prototype within the DoD all the way through to some program of record, right? A program of record within the military space is a program with a set budget line that has typically been developed over several years. And that is not always the best way to solve problems when it comes to innovation. So I think in terms of understanding what other people are doing, it is not just our adversaries. It is also being able to leverage the resourcing that we have here within the United States. We're doing that in a lot of different ways, not only through dual-use technology, but also through private equity in the venture capital space, how the department is learning to better work with private equity and VCs, trying to better understand and envision what that future fight is going to look like. So that's maybe the other aspect of it where you're going at. Within our team, we also have a team of futurists. We do AI futures. And a lot of that is really understanding those Horizon 2 and 3 problem sets 5, 7, 10 years from now, and really understanding, we call it backcasting, right? If you can accurately depict what one of those futures might look like, how do you backcast out decisions that need to be made today so that you are in the vicinity of where you want to be down the road? A lot of that is using technology to do futures. So we can do that qualitatively, quantitatively. We do that in-house. We do it for our clients as well. And then the other piece is your comment around our adversaries are doing it. So how do we compete? We have established as a department that we will compete responsibly. We have adopted our own responsible AI framework, and we have said it does not matter what our adversaries do in certain areas, we will do it the right way. And I think that that's something that everybody in the department really embodies and carries forward with what we do. But it is also understanding, if our adversaries are going to do this, how do we prioritize the limited resourcing that we have? Because you have to cut sling on some things. You have to decide, we are not going to invest in this, which is often the harder problem. And you also have to be able to leapfrog a little bit and say, if we're never going to catch up, what are the things that we do have to focus on? Or how do we let this one thing go to be able to get ahead a little bit further in another area of technical development? I think that's what we're doing right now, is better understanding what that commercial tech landscape might look like for our adversaries, and then backcasting out what our optionality is in the short term to compete fairly.
What is it like as someone, who is very experienced, years of experience? What is it like to just kind of see all of this continuously change and evolve, where you just described that we're in this place of really looking ahead, but also focused on now and how we get there and look at, just it's kind of crazy to think, of how much things have changed and have to keep changing to keep up. What is that like for you, as someone who's been in the industry for a long time?
I think so much of that is just grounded in a lot of my background in social science and the soft science, which is kind of an ironic background to have in technology and engineering. I'm one of the few that probably does have that soft science background, where when you understand human psychology, things are not actually that different than they always have been. The tools that we leverage and, the tools that are enabling us technologically are different and are advancing at a rate that is unprecedented. How humans respond to and leverage those tools is often not that different than how we used name any offset that we've used in the past. And so I think once you understand the fundamentals of the human psychology aspect of it, you understand the fundamentals of how human beings interact with technology. And Di was over, on an episode recently, talking about a lot of that. I think she's one of the foremost leading experts in that area of understanding the human, and not the human as something separate from the system, but the human as the system, which is a massive paradigm shift to the way that we do things currently, of viewing the computer as the system and the human as the user, instead of the human as the system. So I think we're really trying to maintain that type of perspective, in moving forward in an environment that is extremely fast paced and extremely critical and often high pressure, high stakes. I think the more you can ground yourself in the fundamentals of human beings, the easier it is to understand things like adoption, things like risk and responsible AI, especially in the context of the military space and military objectives and warfighting functions. And I think that's what we tend to focus on, at least in my team, when we think about that problem.
I know you mentioned your background, the social sciences and all that isn't necessarily typical, but do you think it is important? And would you maybe recommend getting some experience or education in that if someone is interested in pursuing a similar path?
Yeah, I've been on the ground floor of every major DoD AI effort since 2017 when we first kicked this off with Project Maven. And I think at the time, we actually only had soft science folks. It was extremely rare to find an engineer, to find a software developer who understood AI. And so we have spent the last 5 to 7 years trying to build up a talent base of experts and professionals who could solve these problems with technology. And now we've accomplished that. It is in every, DoD prime, in every organization within the department, you will find machine learning engineers, you will find DevSecOps professionals, you will find all of these individuals who contribute to the problem, or who solve these problems and are contributing to the industry in a very positive way that is based on those technical hard science skills. So I think we naturally have these ebbs and flows where everybody used to be the poli-sci, soft science, human terrain folks. We kind of had this shift where we necessarily had to bring in experts that the department did not previously have. There is no military occupational specialty for AI, for a data scientist. We have ORSAs and you have certain, jobs within each of the services that are well aligned, but AI is not an option. And so I think that we necessarily tried to solve that. Now I think there is, again, another shift in being able to pair a lot of what we're doing technically with approaching these conditions and parameters strategically. And that often requires a little bit more of a holistic perspective and understanding, how to meet that constraint satisfaction and how to use the macro system that is the Department of Defense, which is a government bureaucracy, which often cannot be solved with technology, to be able to architect the right solutions, and not only architect the right solutions, but get them passed, get them funded, get them deployed, get them tested, and be able to have that in production long term.
Are there any recent tech trends or innovations that you are especially excited or optimistic about in light of all of that?
Yeah, I think that there are always trends. Some of them come and go. We think about trends a lot in the context of our futures work, in what we see as trends that, one, span multiple industries or sectors, and trends that last long enough for us to see them as something that then will change the industry long term. So there is a trend that is temporary and often a response to a single trigger or signal. And then there are trends that then convert into long-term advancement. I think some of the areas where we're starting to see, at least within my community, technological advancements that have a lot of promise for the future fight. Within the context of the Alliance, I think we have this entire kind of cluster of technology that's centered on this idea of what is the safe mode for the technologies that we implement within the military? How do we think about attritable algorithms? How do we think about geofencing technology so that if it is not used in the correct environment or in the right location on the globe, that we're able to implement some type of safety mechanism? And that is really a transition from viewing safety and responsibility and governance as a qualitative layer of a technical process and actually now implementing safety in a technical way. And so I think that there's a lot of work being done in that space. I think when we talk about human beings and community, there's a whole other kind of category or cluster of technologies around the interactions that we have with technology and how we do that. What does it look like when there is no user interface? Like, what is zero UI? Like, how do we think about the digital and physical worlds in a way that is more fluid? And I think thus far we've thought about digitizing things, but now we have digital assets that exist in the physical world, which is something that we had not really had precedence for. And that can be anything from like NFTs. We've seen that even with MIT, who's created a lot of digital solutions that have physical impacts. They're in the Media Lab. They have a lot of really great videos on YouTube that show how coding can then influence infrastructure and, different models that they've built in the physical world. I think that is also a really interesting area of development where the idea of human machine teaming, of composite AI, of the way that humans interact with technology is really changing into a space where there's more fluidity between those physical and digital worlds, and the UIs that we have become accustomed to probably won't exist.
You mentioned videos, things like that. Are there any resources in general that you find especially interesting or helpful, especially maybe for someone who wants to learn more about all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I always love it when I get this question, or like, what are you reading lately?
Yeah, everyone wants to know.
They're like my favorite questions because I think it is really easy to have like your book list or, whatever. Or I get it a lot in the education space. Like I'm really interested in, this background or this degree program or this certificate, what do you recommend? And I actually think some of the easiest ways that we can go about educating ourselves is reducing that barrier of exposure and actually just following the right people on social media and kind of having more frequent exposure and interaction to ideas and topics within this space. I follow a lot of really great folks. The Valkyrie Project is one. There are a lot of really great female leaders. Major Signe Jacks, for example, is one who have incredible platforms where they're promoting a lot of these ideas. Dr. Stacy Sims, where we're starting to look more at, it's just easier if you're exposed to things, while you're flipping through. And I think that you retain it a lot more. And I think it becomes part of your daily vocabulary rather than it being this thing that's separate from us. So I've tried to focus on that a lot more over the last year or two. Like, what is the community that I have around me? How do I develop that network? And how do I create as many touch points in the day as I can where I am thinking about, hearing about a lot of these topics.
Especially with social media,
I know.
We're all probably going on Instagram.
Yeah, you don't need to spend 8 hours reading a book. Like just see somebody's posts over and over and over again, and you'll understand the perspective and the content that they're putting out there.
Yeah, so, no, it's such a great point. Another tech innovation that has really done some good for us.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for just coming on and talking about it's such a unique, I think, background. Like we said, we haven't talked about this type of thing on the podcast before. So we really appreciate your insight.
No, I think it's good just being able to contextualize a lot of what the Alliance is doing in sectors that normally are not part of that conversation. So even talking about education, how do we then bring a lot of these military folks into the conversation? I think it's really great what you guys are doing. So I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and share it with a friend. And don't forget that the Data Science Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit that you can support. You can do a one-time donation, become a monthly or annual member, or you can volunteer on our projects and attend our events here in San Diego, California. We have lots going on every single month. So go to our website, datasciencealliance.org, to get involved. Otherwise, we'll see you here next time on The Data Slice.